One of the topics that we have not talked about a lot, but it's prevalent in all the finishing industry, is rework. And there's all different kinds of rework. I'm going to touch on two or three that we see a lot in the powder coating shop and maybe what I think causes those and how we remedy those. So, common ones are going to be fish eyes. I think everybody sees fish eyes. Debris in the powder, making it rough. And third is going to be actual different colors or color contamination in the powder. So, fish eyes, typically, if you have a fisheye, and what does that look like? I don't know that it actually looks like a fisheye, but that's what everybody calls it. It's usually a little tiny round spot in the coating, and then typically it's dipped down to the metal, and you actually see a little bit of bare metal at the bottom of this little tiny circle. And oil on the substrate in general causes that. And so that would mean that the parts are not pre-treated well enough, possibly, or there's oil getting introduced somewhere else in the process. So if you don't clean parts well enough, whether it's steel or aluminum or stainless steel, and there's some sort of grease or oil on there, could be all different kinds, then when you go to powder coat the part, you'll powder coat right over the top. You won't really see anything. But when it goes into the oven to cure, then it heats up that grease or oil that's still on the part. And when the powder gels and is trying to flow, and you've got this foreign substance on the substrate, it's going to typically run away from that because it doesn't want to mix with it. So then it causes that fisheye. Now, that would be the case if there's oil on the substrate, like when it arrived and we didn't get it pre-treated well enough and it's still there. This could happen with like silicone-based oils. Those are notoriously hard to get rid of in a pre-treatment process, and so those can cause a lot of fish eyes. Let's say that we think that our pre-treatment process was really, really good and we're not having any other issues with it or on any other jobs, but all of a sudden we start getting a lot of fish eyes on a particular part. It also could be because there's actually oil in our air. Whether you're blowing off parts with your compressed air and there's oil in it landing on the parts, or air that supplies your powder equipment and it helps you actually spray the powder out could have oil in it, and that's causing fish eyes. The second thing would be just debris in the coating, rough, looks like dirt, just junk in the coating, making it look like it has a texture, just little grains of stuff in it. It looks bad. So what could that be from? Typically, if you have even any kind of pre-treatment process, you should be getting all that washed off for the most part. It's hard for that to stay behind if you're using a high pressure washing system. A lot of the time when we see debris that's caused from our doing would be if it's fallen down from hooks or the carts or crossbars above, or if you have an automated line falling off that from above and actually landing in the powder during curing process. It also could happen when you're just moving the parts around, right? It doesn't have to necessarily have powder on it yet. It could fall on there and you could powder over top of the debris and not necessarily see it, but once it cures out, then you see it. Another cause could be that the powder itself got contaminated, maybe from the manufacturer. In the manufacturing process, something got into the extruder or into the process when it was grinding, something broke off, and there's now a ton of little contaminants, little tiny contaminants that are in the with the powder. Or it could be like we spray out of boxes at Kaiser. Maybe we had a box open and we're combining powders, or just open and something fell in it. Some dust and debris fell inside on top of the powder in there and ended up getting mixed around. So that sprays out onto the part and that causes all the dirt and debris. And then, like we said, it could come from the oven itself. So in our ovens, they are convection ovens, and so the air is turning over in there quite a bit. And if there's a lot of dust and dirt on the floor or getting blown in, then that can get kicked up. And so while that air is circulating, you can actually be circulating dust and dirt through the air, and that can end up landing on the part during the curing process. So let's say the part's kind of in the gel state and flowing out. It's sticky a little bit at that point in the oven, so stuff can easily land and stick on that if you have dust and debris in the air of the oven and it lands on the part. And then the third one is color contamination. So this could happen because we're not doing good enough color changes in our booths, or the powder itself could be contaminated from the manufacturer. So how would we accidentally color contaminate ourselves? So let's say we're going for a big extreme. Let's go red and white. So let's say we sprayed red for half a day, and now we're going to white. So those are really big contrasting colors. We don't want red in the white because you'll see it immediately. So when we go to do a color change, we got to clean the whole booth down, blow it out really, really good. Try to get all the red out of there as much as we possibly can. So that's one thing. We got to get the booth clean so we don't have loose powder particles still in the booth that are red that are going to get on our white parts. The second thing is we got to clean our equipment. So if we were spraying red through our guns and our pickup tubes and our hoses, we got to clean that really good. When we go to white, since white is so particular and gets contaminated very easy, we have special pickup tubes, special pumps, special hoses just for white. So we can eliminate that whole portion of the train to where we know that pickup tube all the way to the hose that's connected to the gun, that's dedicated to white. So we can't get any color contamination there. The gun itself, that needs to be cleaned out well. Usually powder doesn't get left behind in that, but it can, and it'd just be a little few specks of red that may come out of the gun itself and get in the white. Also, just the operator's gear. We wear full spray suits and we change them based on color, so typically that's not a problem. But if you were wearing a red suit for half the day and then you went and sprayed white powder, you're probably gonna get some red powder particles falling off of your suit onto the white parts while you're spraying them. Same thing with your mask, your spray mask. You could have some red powder particles from the morning on your mask, and those could fall onto your white parts, and that could contaminate color-wise. Another one that we don't think about a lot, but it's possible, is in the oven, powder particles can circulate, and in general, I would think and I hope that they gel to stuff and stick, but I'm pretty sure, and everybody out there, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm pretty sure that sometimes they can be circulating around and you can end up with some red powder that's kind of floating through the oven and ends up sticking on your white parts, especially maybe it's your first cart of white and you are running red for an entire day. So there could be some color contamination in the oven. Of course, if you put a cart of red parts and a cart of white parts in at the same time and they're both powder, then you definitely could have some cross contamination happening. Real heavy air movement could start moving some powder particles off of either of the uncured powder yet, red to white, white to red, and you could get back and forth mixing. You don't want to put two different colors of parts in the oven at the same time because that's definitely could cause color contamination. We've seen it quite a bit actually, where the colors are coming in, the powder's coming in from a manufacturer and it's already contaminated at that point. That's just simply because they didn't do a good enough job on their color change when they were switching from color to color. And so some of the red in their system carried over into the white. So how do we kind of catch these things? How do we decide what the issue is, the scale of the issue, and if we're going to contact a manufacturer and tell them like, hey, we think there's something wrong with your powder, it's not us, it's you guys. So in general, fisheyes usually are on a smaller scale for us. We don't see them a lot just because our pre-treatment process is really, really good. But if we do have a fisheye problem, it's usually disastrous. Why is that? Well, we have very consistent pre-treatment processes, but if parts come in that have a weird oil on them and we don't know that, and we kind of pre-treat the same way, and we are not going to see all these fisheyes until we get a cart coming out of the oven, and it's going to be covered in fisheyes, typically. Or it's significant enough and it's multiple enough that it's definitely very obvious. And so we aren't going to really catch it until that point. And so then at that point we stop and say, okay, what's happening here? the order before this, totally different parts. Did we have any problems? No. Okay, all of a sudden we have problems on this order. Yes. Is it every part on this order? Or is it just one cart or one area? Okay, it's every single part. All right, that's probably pre-treatment, possibly. Or do we all of a sudden have oil in our air? So typically what we'll do is if we have parts coming out good and now we have parts coming out bad, we'll try to change to a different job and continue on and see if parts start coming out good again. Because if that's the case, then we know it's not oil in the air. If we can get good parts before, now we have bad parts, we get good parts after, we haven't changed our air at all, now we know we can eliminate oil in the air and we can just go straight to pre-treatment. We got to work on our pre-treatment to try to get these parts cleaner so we don't see fish eyes. For the dirt and debris, in general, if we see that, we're going to say, man, it's probably not pre-treatment. We're not really thinking about pre-treatment if it's just dirt and debris. We're probably going to be looking, is it falling off of carts? How consistent is it? Is it everywhere? All sides of the part? If that's the case, and it's really high volume of debris, then we pretty much immediately will go to, that powder's probably contaminated. If it's just here and there, it just happened. Something fell in it, something blew into it, got caught. We just rework that particular part. If it's on every angle, doesn't matter what direction we're spraying, underneath, sideways, on top, it's probably coming out with the powder. So then how do we kind of identify that? We'll grab some sample panels and spray those out and see where we're at. We try to spray sample panels before we even start spraying powder. So if we have brand new boxes of powder, we try to spray a few panels out just to see if we can notice anything off. Sometimes you catch stuff, sometimes you don't. And so if we see a ton of debris, then we will spray, instead of a couple panels, we'll spray 10 panels and look at those really close and see if we think the debris is in those panels. And if we do, and we think there is debris there, then maybe we'll say, okay, we'd like to finish out this order. Do we have another box of powder that's maybe out of a different batch? Same color, but out of a different batch. Let's get that out. Let's spray some parts. Oh, those parts came out good. Okay, so now we feel like we've isolated it to the powder itself. We open up a corrective action with one of our suppliers and let them know, like, hey, here's the issue. Give them all the data points. We think that this particular box of powder is contaminated. We need you to investigate this and then get back to us by a certain date. Color contamination, same kind of situation. If it's specks here and there, a cluster, but nowhere else, we pretty much chalk that up to it's fallen out of somewhere in the booth, fell off of an operator, and so not much we can do about that at that point in time, but we could rework the part. If we see very consistent everywhere, again, all sides, then for one, it still could be our equipment. If our equipment was not cleaned good enough, we didn't do a good enough color change in our actual pickup tube, hose, and gun, that could still be constantly letting some, let's say, red powder out while we're spraying white. So we'll investigate that further, clean it really good, try to get some good sample panels coming out to where we don't have any contamination. If we get everything re-cleaned and we're still spraying and we're still getting some issues with color contamination, we'll grab another box of the same color, see what happens there. If it goes away, then we say, it's probably that box of powder. Again, we open a corrective action with the supplier, try to explain to them what's happened, take pictures of the parts themselves and the sample panels and show them, like, hey, here's where we think there's a color contamination issue. We think it's only in this batch or it's only in these boxes. Can you look into this for us? And so that's typically how we evaluate that. I always try to look at it from the standpoint of, let's blame our processes first. Let's figure out if it's something we're doing. When was the last time we got good parts? We're having bad parts right now. Is there a way, can we adjust a few variables and see if we can get the parts coming out good again? Because then we can start really pinpointing where in the process of this happening, what do we need to actually address so we can continue to go forward and not keep having the same problem. Those types of rework scenarios with fish eyes, debris in the coating, and color contamination all of them can cause really big havoc in our production schedule and can add significant cost to the process because could be a ton of rework involved if it's a catastrophic issue. So over time at Kaiser, we've slowly but surely implemented more and more steps or checks in the process to try to keep it from having 10 carts come out of the oven, which could be thousands of parts, and every single one has a defect, and it's the same defect. When we're getting into a run of something big, we try to spray sample panels of our powders if they're brand new coming out of the box, just to try to evaluate them. And then we try to maybe gel or just get one cart coming out of the oven and look it over really good to see if we have any issues. Do we have any fisheyes? Do we have any debris? Do we have any color contamination? And if we do, we can catch it right on that first cart, and then we can adjust for the other 9 carts. Sometimes we still fail at that, and we end up with a ton of carts coming out that need reworked, which is frustrating because we do have quite a few processes in place to try to avoid that. If everything went perfect and easy, it probably wouldn't actually be that fun because there wouldn't be never any problems to solve, and we would never really learn anything. So every time something like that happens, we learn a lot. We've gotten to the point where our processes are pretty robust, and almost always when there's an issue like that, we pretty much trace it back to a powder itself now, that there's just some contamination in it from the factory. And to give you a little insight on how that works, obviously the powder company is going to probably think that their powder's fine, and they're going to want to tell you that it's your process, because there's so many things that can go wrong in a powder coating process that, in most shops it probably is the process itself and not the powder. So that's why we try to be really diligent, take all the notes down, try to figure out every possible way that it could be us. If we still can't find the answer, then I start thinking, well, this powder might be contaminated. We get sample panels, so we have proof of that. Try to take some pictures of the parts, so we have proof of that. Pictures of the box, so we give the batch number and the box number. Then we go ahead and get a hold of a rep in the lab. And typically powder companies will keep retain powder out of their batches so they can spray that retain out right there in their lab and see if they can duplicate the imperfection that you're seeing that's causing your rework. Now, it's happened to me multiple times, probably 70% of the time, where I have narrowed it down and I know for a fact that it's definitely the powder. The lab will spray out their retain and say, nope, powder's fine. And then I have to stand my ground and say, no, it's not. The stuff that we have is not fine. I want to send it in, and I want you to spray out of the boxes that we have so you can see that the powder is not okay. And typically I win those arguments, and they agree that, yes, there is definitely something wrong with this powder. Why is that the case, and why does that happen? The thing that you have to pay attention to, and it can kind of help you be confident in these situations, is, for one, batch number. So if all your boxes are showing a similar issue and they're all out of the same batch, pretty good indication there's something wrong with that batch. Now, if the powder lab has retain out of that same batch, but they're saying theirs is good, then my next question is when did you take the retain in your run? Because typically, especially if these are really common colors, they're running like 5,000 pounds at a time, at least, probably more. So on most boxes, most manufacturers, sometimes it's harder to understand their numbers, but they'll have a batch number and then they'll have a box number. So if it's box number 1 of their run and you're seeing that you have color contamination, that's plausible because it's the first box that they decided to start yielding out of their extruder, meaning they were running red and now they're running white. At some point they have to decide, okay, we're going to stop throwing this away and we're going to actually start yielding powder and taking this white and we're going to use it. We're going to crush it up, grind it up, and use it as powder. If they yield too soon, then there could be some contamination and junk issues there. So box 1 through 5, 50-pound boxes, let's say, that could be 1 to 250 pounds. Contamination is possible there. So that's likely. And if they don't take their retain until the 5,000th pound, they're obviously not going to see the same contamination you're seeing because it's gone after 5,000 pounds. Now, if the box number that you're spraying out of are 100, 102, and 110, and you're still seeing contamination, now maybe that entire batch is a problem. So that's typically what I look at to give me an indication of like, okay, I don't think it's us. I think it's the powder. What box numbers are we at? Do we have any other powder in this batch that we've sprayed out of that we think is good? Okay, what box number is those? And that happens to us, but typically it'll be box 65 we've sprayed out of this batch ABC, let's say, and it's good. But box 2 out of batch ABC has color contamination in it. Makes sense. Early on in the run, little contamination is gone by the time we get to box 65. That makes sense. So that helps me decide like, okay, it's probably not us at this point. It's probably the powder itself. In a production setting, when these things happen and you're seeing these rework issues, you got to try to keep going as hard as you can and run that rework back in as soon as you can, because almost always we're on a tight deadline. We got to ship as soon as possible. So how do we do that without just causing this total crapshoot in our schedule? The best case scenario, if we think there's something wrong with the powder itself, is we have more powder and we're lucky enough that it's out of another batch. Because if that's the case, more than likely just take the powder out of the other batch and keep on going to finish your order out, and then rework the few stuff that went wrong and spray it with the powder out of a different batch. So that's really helpful. The pre-treatment side, if we think there's fish eyes, then typically we'll halt. We can't continue to spray powder if we think we have a pre-treatment issue and we still have like half of an order still to spray. Because if it's a pre-treatment issue, we need to go back through pre-treatment, right? So that usually is a real big brake pump. Got to stop. We got to totally readjust what's happening. Try to keep the sprayers in the spray booth going while we pre-treat, rewash, re-clean all these other 6 carts. And then on top of that, got to rework these ones that already look bad. So when it's a contamination issue, a fisheye that ends up being because of grease or oil, and we got to go back through pre-treatment, that's a pretty big deal. If it's something where we isolate it down to the powder, as long as we can switch out to a different batch of powder, same color, that's not that bad, because we can just continue on and really not have any issues.